Hey folks, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. This is your host, Paul F. Austin, and today we're sharing a special bonus episode featuring a remarkable conversation with the renowned ethnobotanist, Mark Plotkin. We recorded this during a live info session about our upcoming practitioner intensive, and Mark will be joining us for that practitioner intensive, which is really exciting. So Dr. Plotkin has spent over 3 decades studying traditional indigenous plant medicine with elder shamans throughout Central and South America. Named an environmental hero for the planet by Time magazine, he has dedicated his life to protecting biological and cultural diversity in the Amazon rainforest as president of the Amazon Conservation Team. Once you've finished this episode, I encourage you to check out my full interview with Mark on episode 134 of the podcast if you want an even deeper dive into his work. So today's conversation gives you a preview of the wisdom that Dr. Plotkin will be sharing at our February 8 to 15 Costa Rican intensive, where he'll be leading exclusive workshops on indigenous wisdom and modern healing practices. We are handling this intensive at Reunion in Costa Rica, where there will be 3 guided psilocybin experiences with deep integration work and professional development. We still have a few spots available at a special rate for practitioners, leaders, and entrepreneurs looking to explore how expanded consciousness can transform their life in a community of people who are committed to this work. If you're interested in this opportunity, just go to psychedeliccoaching.institute and click Costa Rica Intensive in the main menu. So in this discussion, Dr. Plotkin shares profound insights about the delicate balance between commercialization and preservation of sacred medicines, essential lessons from indigenous healers about humility and continuous learning, historical context of psilocybin mushroom use in Oaxaca, the critical importance of protecting uncontacted tribes and ancestral wisdom, why proper preparation and community support matter in psychedelic work, and practical advice for practitioners who want to work with these powerful medicines. Mark has been a friend over the last few years. We are so honored to have him at this upcoming intensive. His elderly wisdom, the lineage of teachers that he comes from. His teacher is Dr. Richard Evans Schultes, who is the renowned ethnobotanist who actually brought back ayahuasca from the Amazon about 90 years ago. So it'll be great to have Mark at the upcoming intensive. All right, that's it for now. Let's get into the conversation with Dr. Mark Plotkin. Well, it's great to have you. Mark, where are you at the moment? Where are you calling in from?
I am in my office at Falls Church, Virginia.
Beautiful. So, I think kind of the first question that I had for you is, I would consider you to be one of the most, renowned ethnobotanists, and your teacher, Richard Evans Schultes, almost, if I'm not mistaken, invented the profession in many ways. And how much time do you spend out in the field versus in the office, and sort of what do you love about both places?
Well, it's difficult to answer because we're still coming out of the pandemic. So, like everybody else, I was holed up for a couple of years. So I'm trying to spend as much field time as possible. But the big news from our end is I've just come back from opening the Center for the Protection of the Guardians of Ancestral Wisdom in the Northeast Amazon.
Wow.
Which is sort of the culmination of many decades of work, where we took the information that I'd collected and my colleague, fellow ethnobotanist Bruce Huffman, and turned it into a book in the local language being Trio. That's the dominant tribe, although there's about 14 different tribes. And that's their handbook it's essentially the shaman's physician desk reference. So that was very fulfilling. And so, I'm not spending any time doing basic ethnobotanical research in the sense of what do you use this for, we use that for, much more focused on protection of culture and ancestral rainforests.
Well, and this is what you spoke about in your TED Talk in 2015, was the most valuable resource that we're losing is the intelligence of the shamans and the sort of indigenous peoples that may be lost, specifically uncontacted tribes. You were sort of emphasizing as part of that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, there's news on that front. Last year, we were appointed to head the Secretariat of the Protection of Uncontacted Peoples. So that's a real feather in our hat, in an age where we're trying to turn as much of the driving role, as you might say, management role over to the indigenous peoples themselves. But the fellow we have that heads the program is Colombian, but was so highly regarded by his indigenous colleagues, they asked him and ACT, my organization, the Amazon Conservation Team, to take the lead.
And how has that process gone then? What's sort of the maybe end goal or objective of supporting that?
Well, I guess the best analogy would be the Russian doll, where you open the doll and there's another doll inside. In that, by protecting isolated peoples who we do not want to contact, we have to work with the contacted tribes that surround them, which means we have to protect enormous swathes of rainforest in order to protect the contacted and the uncontacted tribe. And what we find is that the issue of isolated, uncontacted tribes, people living in voluntary isolation, lost tribes, whatever you want to call them, has an immense and iconic appeal in a way which just trying to sell conservation on the basis of psychedelics or medicinal plants or human rights or water quality or fighting climate change does not. So it doesn't mean that we have just shifted our focus to isolate peoples. It just means it's another tool in the conservation toolbox to make the argument to the general public and to decision makers and stakeholders that this needs to be a priority for all of us.
It reminds me a little bit of at the end of Brave New World, Aldous Huxley's renowned book that was written in 1933. It sort of ends with there's some sort of celebration of the sort of wild, the indigenous, the type of sort of primal connection to the land and the earth that we've lost. Because a lot of what Huxley criticized was this onward march of the machine and how it's consuming everything. And we've seen how that has played out in the Amazon in particular, right? And so the ability to really, I think, especially in today's sort of globalized world, when the machine is consuming everything, how do we protect those who are still in that deep sort of relationship or connection to the wild in many ways?
Well, as you well know, if there was an easy answer, you wouldn't be asking me. There is no easy answer to that. But also, as you well know, one of the answers, one of many of the answers, is psychedelics, because when you give people an experience, access to an experience like that, they typically come through with a connection to the whole, feeling that they're part of the universe in ways which may not have been the case. Although one of the things that I want to touch on in our session in Costa Rica is that it's also important that we don't oversell psychedelics as the panacea, which I'm afraid many people are doing. You know, in Michael Pollan's wonderful book, How to Change Your Mind, which I put on the suggested reading list, which I hope you'll circulate with people who'll be attending, he makes the point that a lot of people who are seeking solace in psychedelics are people who are emotionally fragile and can come apart in the wrong settings, is not an infrequent occasion. Another aspect to this is that people may not come away with the love and oneness message we're all seeking. I gave a talk at a conference at UCLA along with my buddy Paul Stamets, and I had just come across a quote from some tech billionaire where he said, you know, psilocybin has changed my life. I took psilocybin for the first time. It was a deeply intense experience, and I finally understand Bitcoin.
So maybe not always what it's cut out to be. Some people are just too deep in the matrix, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So a lot of folks who are attending today, who will be at the retreat with us, they are practitioners, and a lot of the emphasis for practitioners has been on the more clinical, sort of psychotherapeutic, one-to-one model. Sure. What do you think? What are the lessons and wisdom and perspectives that are important to incorporate into a modern practice that indigenous peoples of the Amazon have been leaning into and working with as part of their relationship with ayahuasca and yopo and maybe even San Pedro in the Sacred Valley?
Well, I want to make 2 points at the outset. Number one is I've been doing this stuff a long time,
Yeah.
almost always in an indigenous setting with indigenous shamans. The flip side of that is I'm not a practitioner, I'm not a healer, I'm not an herbalist, I'm not a shaman. So understand where I'm coming from. And I think that one of the takeaways that I've had in trying to think about, lessons that we can all share together going into this workshop is that it really is a quest. It really is a search. And if you guys have all seen Fantastic Fungi, which should be a requirement for this course, and I assume most of you have, and I also want to emphasize, if you've only seen it once, you haven't really seen it. And if you haven't seen it under the effects of mushrooms, you really need to go back and do that. Seriously. However, there are miraculous cures that do occur, like the classic case that Stamets gave in the film, where he climbed the tree having a terrible stutter and came down from the tree and never stuttered again. Okay, so these things do happen. But I do think that it's a process where, the use of these sacred plants and fungi, and now animals, because we know there's hallucinogenic frogs in the Amazon, is not something which is sort of a one-shot deal. We all like to look for the quick hit, the magic bullet, and I like to think of psychedelics much more like a shotgun blast than a bullet, that it's going to take many sessions and a lot of integration afterwards, especially, and certainly some pre-integration beforehand to really get the full effect. And also, I want to make clear that I do not believe that practitioners who go to Esalen for a weekend and come out thinking they're ayahuasca shamans will have all of the abilities and power of the knowledge that some of these shamans do. I mean, I've done a lot of work in the Sibundoy, which is the cradle of ayahuasca. That's where my mentor first encountered ayahuasca in 1941. And so I was asked to give the the commencement address at Tulane Medical School. And by way of preparation, I asked the great paramount shaman from the tribe that had taught ayahuasca to Schultes how long it took him to become a shaman, a taita, which is what they call shamans. And he said, well, in your terms, I'm 93 years old. He said, I started drinking the remedio, the medicine, when I was 5. He said, I'm still learning. And I thought, what a great lesson for all of us. A life lesson that goes far beyond entheogens and psychedelics. And so, again, we all need to keep learning. And you may have finished medical school or psychedelic training or some of the great third wave courses, but, you need to keep at it. I mean, there have been 2 major stories in the New York Times in the last 2 days on how psychedelics are revolutionizing medicine. So whatever you know, there's going to be something new coming down the pike before the workshop. That's how fast the field is changing. And that's why we have to keep an open mind and keep learning.
Well, and humility really is I think if I could have one takeaway with the practitioners who go through our program, who come on the retreats, it is the humility of how we work with these medicines, that we, are in many ways stewards of these different sort of sacred entheogens, and even in the Amazon with shamans that have worked with this for eons and generations. These are not medicines to be trifled with. There's a level of reverence that is required if committing to this work, and if we don't hold that reverence, we could find ourselves in certain precarious situations, and that's what we want to avoid as practitioners, is precarious situations.
I think that's undoubtedly true, and all of us who've had experience with these substances, which I assume is everybody on the call, is that bad trips do happen,
right.
And it's not all fun and games. And of course, we want to avoid that. The Taitas in the Sibundoy Valley say if you have a bad experience, that's what you needed. The medicine gives you what you need. If you take the mushrooms or you take the drink and you don't see anything, well, that's what you needed. I've had people say, well, yeah, I went, I paid all this money and I went to Peru and I took ayahuasca and I didn't see anything. Well, if you want a light show, go to Disneyland, okay? So sometimes you're in the 9th dimension making love with the goddess of the river underwater, and sometimes you wake up 6 hours later and think, I don't know where I got anything out of that.
Right. And sometimes the breakthroughs or the experience, like you said, it's not about the visuals. We get hung up on that expectation, and many of my most profound experiences are just sort of perspectives and insights that come online as a result of the sort of normal default perspectives being out of the way.
Yes, I share that experience. And one of the things that I find much more common with ayahuasca than with mushrooms is a week later, I'll be walking down the street and I'll have this realization, oh shit, that's what that meant. I didn't realize it,
Right.
you know? So this is not a scientific comparison, but we just have to be open to learning lessons, which may be long after the alkaloids have left our body.
Right. And I think that speaks also to the value of community. And in the West, we have sort of a very atomized, individualized lens, which I think can sometimes make that integration process with psychedelics that much more difficult. What have you learned as an ethnobotanist working in the Amazon about this relationship between, tribes, community, collective living, and sort of the potency and power of psychedelics?
Well, as healthcare practitioners, I think they have a great advantage over you guys because everybody's living in a community for the most part. And so you really know a lot more about what's bothering a person if you're living with them and knowing they're having trouble with their spouse or they're having trouble with their sexuality or they're having trouble in the hunt or whatever, versus somebody who shows up in your workshop in your office in Berkeley or at Esalen or wherever and gives you a very brief and sometimes, oftentimes I would bet, not an honest account of what's really troubling them. And so how do you suss that out? And our job in helping people through these experiences is really to catalyze a lot of what can be done and to act as guardrails so they don't, veer too far off and get lost. But, you have to trust the medicine. And, when you don't really know people long and well and you don't live in a community with them and you don't know deeply what the issues might be, you're at a disadvantage compared to people at the same tribe, people at the same indigenous group who, have been living near or with these people for decades at a time.
Now, we've been talking a lot about ayahuasca, but psilocybin mushrooms will be the substance, the medicine, the drug that we work with in Costa Rica for the upcoming retreat. What's sort of your perspective on mushrooms? What have you learned about them? I know, you've been hosting a podcast now for many years now, which folks should check out, Plants of the Gods. What is sort of unique about specifically mushrooms as a entheogenic substance?
Well, I've done, I think, 5 episodes on magic mushrooms, on Plants of the Gods. Plants of the Gods, it's on all podcast platforms. We're approaching 2 million downloads, so we really found quite an audience. And thank you. And, as somebody who grew up in the 70s, I did mushrooms in college, just kind of in a silly way, but really wanted to get to I would say the roots of the issue, but I guess I should say the mycelia of the issue. I went down to Oaxaca where my mentor Schultes, who was down there in 1936 and encountered the mushrooms with the original Mazatec healers. And just to paint a broader picture, this story is not all about Maria Sabina, okay? Maria Sabina was a very gifted healer, but there were many gifted healers down there. So the literature is focused way too much on Maria Sabina as being the manifestation of all that was known and all that was good about the mushrooms. And when I first went down there, which was about 25 years ago, I worked with a curandera, a healer, Doña Julieta, who was considered the equivalent of Maria Sabina, as were others. And she said, we use a variety of mushrooms to heal. She says, but 2 of them have disappeared since I was a kid because of climate change. And that was 25 years ago, and these guys were already noticing climate change. So at the time, mushrooms were still not a secret, but it just was kept slightly under wraps. Now, the last time I was there, which was about 1.5 years ago, the key to my hotel room was a wooden mushroom. Okay, when you enter the Jimenez, the essentially origin of the mushroom cults, it says, welcome to Mushroom Land, and there's posters of Maria Sabina and keychains of her and Frida Kahlo everywhere. So this has become very popularized, very commercial, which has its obvious upside and downside. So I think that the mushrooms can speak for themselves. I don't want to speak for them. I do find them, on the whole, gentler than ayahuasca, perhaps not as deeply impactful in the short term as the yopo snuff, but that I really want to encourage people to do this at the workshop. But if you really want to drill down deeper, you really should go to Huautla, where the Mazatec, the Zapotec, and at least one or two other tribes have been doing this since before the conquest. And I want to encourage people to check out our Schultes storybook map. As I said, Schultes was my mentor. He did the first field work with peyote, with the Native American tribe, I think in 1936, then went down to Oaxaca and discovered, of course, Schultes says, we ethnobotanists don't discover anything. It's our indigenous guides and teachers who do the discovery and teach it to us. And from there, he went down to the Northwest Amazon, specifically Putumayo and the Colombian Amazon, and discovered ayahuasca. So Huautla de Jimenez is where it all began. And if you really want to pursue the study of mushrooms, I think you all have to make a pilgrimage there. I also want to point out there's some very, very good literature on this stuff, and my two favorites are the new book by Paul Stamets, which I think comes out in January.
Oh,
I was
fantastic!
Able to read the galleys. It's called Psilocybin Mushrooms in Their Native Habitat. It's on the reading list, and so we're meeting in February. The book will be out in January.
Fantastic.
The other is by Christopher Hobbs, and everybody should know the name Christopher Hobbs. He's obviously not as well known as Stamets, but he is a third-generation herbalist. Went to China many years ago, learned Chinese, writes Chinese, studied traditional acupuncture. And the Chinese were long much more sophisticated than us in using mushrooms for medicinal purposes. So he wrote a book called Medicinal Mushrooms, The Essential Guide. It's in the reading list. And everybody should have that on the shelf. And there is at least one chapter on magic mushrooms. And I warn you that a lot of what's written about this stuff is either crap or stuff that's been boulderized and plagiarized and recopied from the real good stuff. So if you start with Stamets and Hobbs, anything they write can be trusted. And there's no shortage of material to read about magic mushrooms these days, but these are the two best.
Right. Well, I just have one final question, which, you've been running a nonprofit, the Amazon Conservation Team, which I would encourage everyone to look into and support. And you've really, I would say, shied away from the commercialization of psychedelics that's been happening over these last 5 years. And I'd love if you could just speak to what are some of the risks and concerns from your perspective about what's happening now with sort of the commercialization of a lot of these sacred medicines. What do you think we need to be cautious of or aware of as we sort of go into this unknown future?
Well, the first thing is self-preservation. With the appeal of big money, it's attracted a lot of people who should not be trusted. I hear people go to prove based on a shaman they found through Yelp, and that's not the way to do it. Any combination of the sacred and money or power, it's a difficult combo, and it's hard to get right. It's easy to get wrong. So you really got to be careful about who you're entrusting yourself with, because how much more vulnerable could you be than being in some remote place in Mexico or Peru or Colombia when you're tripping your brains out, especially people that aren't used to travel, don't speak Spanish or Portuguese, especially women are very vulnerable. So be careful. Okay. Number two is you need to look at how is the money being used. I'm approached regularly by companies that either producing psilocybin or want to synthesize psilocybin, and they're all going to help the Indians, but not just yet, right? So they're going to raise billions and billions of dollars, but they want ethnobotanists like me to tell them how to do it, and then they're going to help the Indians in 20 years. Well, I call bullshit. You want to help these people, help them now. So all of you who are practitioners, I would encourage you to support local efforts aimed at protecting the forest, aimed at protecting the fungi aimed at protecting the plants. For example, Indy Garcia Flores, I can give you his contact info when I'm down there in Costa Rica, is a Mazatec librarian, keeper of the flame, has this fabulous library that he's created, interviews with the Oaxaca, interviews with Maria Sabina, and these little grassroots efforts, which don't take millions and millions of dollars to sustain, are worthy of support. Other groups that are helping indigenous peoples or peasant peoples that are being integrated into this practice of using psychedelics to heal. Grassroots stuff is a way to give back. I started out by talking about how these entheogenic substances give us a feeling of oneness and a connection, everything, but then people don't give anything back to the people of the plants and the mushrooms. So I find that at best ironic, and at worst cynical or puzzling. So if you want to support our work, Amazon Conservation Team, easy to find. You can look it up under my name. Make some year-end donations. We're a 501c3. It's tax deductible. You've got last-minute Christmas or Hanukkah shopping or Kwanzaa shopping to do. Make a donation in somebody's name. Do some good, and not have to spend your time in malls when COVID is on the resurgence.
Well, Mark, I appreciate I appreciate you joining today live and taking the time. I know your event is a big moment for nonprofits. So just taking time out of your schedule to hop on and be live with us. And, I'm also so grateful that you'll be joining us in February in Costa Rica. When I sent you that email a month or so ago, I was like, kind of shot in the dark, and I was just so appreciative that you took us up on it and are going to be there in February with us in Costa Rica. We're really honored by your presence and your willingness to come join us. So,
well, I have to confess, Paul, thank you for your kind words, but I have to confess I'm being a bit selfish here, because for years people saying, what's the difference between taking magic mushrooms with a Mazatec shaman and taking it with a professional guide? And the honest answer is, I don't know, because I've never done it with a professional guide. So people think I'm being an ethnobotanical snob saying, I'd only take it with shamans. Well, as you guys know, there aren't enough professional guides to go around. And like I said, you got to be careful of who is presenting themselves as a professional guide. So my selfish agenda is to be able to enter a bit into your world, learn a bit more, and maybe connect you a bit to the world that I've had the honor and privilege of participating in for a couple of decades, and living happily ever after.
A true collaboration, a mycelial collaboration, if there ever is one. Well, thank you, Mark, again, and I wish you all the best of luck with end of year fundraising and all the work that you continue to do.
Well, I thank you guys for tuning in. I look forward to meeting everyone in person in Costa Rica. We're living in challenging times. Let's wish for the best and for happy endings for all of us.
Thanks again, Mark.
Okay, guys. Thanks again. Ciao.
Hey listeners, Paul here. I hope you enjoyed our special bonus episode with Mark Plotkin. As you heard, he'll be joining us this February 8 to 15 in Costa Rica for what promises to be an extraordinary gathering of practitioners and leaders in the psychedelic space. A quick reminder to head to the link in the description of this episode to see the full show notes and any of the links that we mentioned in this episode. And if today's conversation resonated with you and you want to join us in Costa Rica, visit psychedeliccoaching.institute to learn more about this transformative opportunity. We still have a few spots remaining for this intimate gathering with Dr. Plotkin and other practitioners who are committed to this work on the deepest level. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Thanks so much for watching. For a deeper dive into the power of microdosing with complimentary practice and extra guidance, check out our best-selling microdosing course. It's a science-based protocol with dozens of best practices so you can customize your protocol to your unique needs and goals. Check out the link in the description below.